In this section, we'll look at the background to the Vietnam War and see how Harry Truman helped lay the foundations. First, you have to understand that Vietnam in Southeast Asia is a nation with a distinct culture, language, and traditions. While they are a single people, they have been controlled by outsiders throughout most of their history. First the Mongols and the Chinese, and during the 19th century the French took over the area. It was the same time that America was controlling the Philippines, and it was the age of imperialism, and the French took over that part of Southeast Asia, which became known as French Indochina. A Vietnamese independent movement headed by Ho Chi Minh began fighting against the French. Ho Chi Minh was born into poverty and fled colonial Vietnam and went to Paris. He petitioned the French government for democratic reforms and more power to the Vietnamese people, but the French rejected his lobbying. He then turned to the French Communist Party. He worked in the 1920s and 1930s as a revolutionary communist organizer in the Soviet Union, in China, Thailand, and Vietnam. In 1930, he organized the Indochinese Communist Party and helped incite a series of revolts which were brutally suppressed by the French. When Hitler conquered France in 1940 and Japan took over Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh began to fight the Japanese. Fighting against the Japanese in World War II, Ho Chi Minh organized the Viet Minh. The idea for organized struggle had obviously existed for years, but the Viet Minh was one of the first real organizations and strategy Ho Chi Minh had accomplished. It tapped the vast reservoir of Vietnamese nationalism. It didn't really have a whole lot of communist revolutionary rhetoric, instead adopted a platform that stressed independence and democratic reforms, and this was probably because it was more appealing and most people couldn't understand the communist ideology anyway. The Viet Minh would organize in the mountains of northern Vietnam to raid the Japanese in some of the larger cities. And they also, it should be noted, got assistance from the United States and the West. Of course, they were fighting Japan as well. It was a really rough time for Vietnam, and the brutal treatment by the Japanese obviously helped increase the Viet Minh's popularity. By 1945, the Viet Minh had an organized army of over 5,000 soldiers, and it was helped by a professor of history who took over the leadership of the army, General Nguyen Giap. When the Japanese surrendered, the Viet Minh opportunistically declared itself the government of Vietnam. It was on September 2nd, 1945. It occupied the government buildings in Hanoi, which had been the capital. Ho Chi Minh officially declared his country independent of all colonial masters. Standing in a faded khaki suit and rubber sandals, which had sort of become his trademark, he cited the United States Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. So he quoted directly from the U.S. Declaration of Independence. The U.S., interestingly, had a strong presence at the ceremony. U.S. Army officers stood on the reviewing stand with Giap. The U.S. warplane ceremoniously flew overhead, and the Vietnamese band even played the Star-Spangled Banner. Giap spoke of Vietnam's, quote, particularly intimate relations with the U.S., something he noted which, quote, it's pleasant duty to dwell upon. The problem was the French wanted their colony back after World War II. After defeat in the war, many felt, as one government official said, quote, France can only be a great power so long as our flag continues to fly in all overseas territory. So obviously the French were a little sensitive after their defeat from Germany. France had controlled not only Vietnam, but Cambodia and Laos. Again, it was French Indochina, and they wanted it back. The French were encouraged because the Viet Minh had not made significant gains in the southern part of the country of Vietnam. And with the assistance of the French just after the war began expelling the Viet Minh from one of the largest cities in the south, known as Saigon. For over a year, up to 1946, the French and the Viet Minh attempted to reach a compromise, but ultimately it wasn't possible. The French, unlike the British, had always rejected territory or dominion status, instead insisting on full assimilation, full French citizenship. For the Viet Minh's reasons, the French occupation was, the South was unacceptable, not only because they wanted independence for the entire country, but because the French-controlled South produced the food supply that was necessary for the overpopulated industrial North. For a while, the U.S. actively opposed French recolonization. With Japanese controlled, the U.S. recognized for the first time the area's potential for raw materials and foodstuffs. And many people in the United States feared a long, drawn-out war between the French and Viet Minh would disrupt the trading. Many in the U.S. also thought that if the French gained control again, they would restore monopolistic controls, which would deny raw materials and naval bases that might actually work to the Americans' favor if the Viet Minh controlled them. FDR, you might recall, had opposed recolonization because he believed that colonialism was doomed in Asia, and he also, frankly, didn't like the French leader Charles de Gaulle. FDR favored sort of an internationalist trusteeship on a temporary basis to prepare Vietnam for independence. While Ho Chi Minh appealed directly to Truman, Truman, however, decided to support French recolonization. He sought a changed U.S. policy. Most importantly, Truman was thinking in terms of, again, of containment, the world balance of power and spreading communism. He wasn't thinking specifically about Vietnam itself or its history. He saw Ho Chi Minh as a potential communist subverter, and he didn't want communism to spread to Vietnam. And he also was worried about the French sort of being a loose cannon in Europe. He wanted the French to be solidly on the west side, so he wanted to appease the French as well. He clearly thought Europe was much more crucial to the Cold War than Asia anyway. And so Truman, therefore, notified de Gaulle that the U.S. would not stand in the way of French recolonization. This decision of Truman's was a really fateful and unfortunate one. U.S. diplomats in Vietnam insisted that they saw no direct contact between the Viet Minh and the Soviet Union. They declared that Vietnam could become a fertile field for American capital and enterprise. And they noted that Ho Chi Minh had even raised the possibility of a U.S. naval base in Vietnam. This is understanding because this Ho Chi Minh had gotten aid from the Soviets in fighting the French before World War II, and if he feared anybody was going to keep him from being independent, it was probably going to be the Soviets. So appealing to the United States might be a counterbalance to the Soviets. Anyway, the diplomats thought that Ho was a nationalist first and foremost, and he sort of had communist connections because they're the only ones willing to oppose the French. The intelligence community, however, at home was just obsessed with the idea of containment, and so Truman decided that he would support the French recolonization, and the U.S. would just maintain what he called a pro-French neutrality. It was kind of in an awkward situation because the United States had always supported independence from colonialism, and yet here it didn't serve their larger Cold War goals. By 1950, the time when the U.S. had decided really not to block the French recolonization, the Viet Minh had actually begun to gain the upper hand. Ho Chi Minh controlled an estimated two-thirds of the countryside, especially at night. And to offset French dominance in the air, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh often came out from hiding at night, sabotaging power plants and factories and tossing grenades into theaters or assassinating French officials. One American correspondent reported, quote, "Anyone with white skin caught outside protected areas after dark is courting a horrible death." The French had a sort of a puppet leader, the Emperor Bo Dai, who was increasingly unpopular among the Vietnamese. He was known as the Playboy Emperor, and he spent all of his time gambling and chasing women. He put wealthy southern landowners in his cabinet, although, again, the real power was probably with the French officials. And actually, Bo Dai spent all of his time either on his 600-ton air-conditioned yacht or in the French Riviera. A U.S. ambassador sarcastically said Bo Dai was, quote, "the stuff of which Churchills are made." With the Viet Minh beginning to gain the upper hand, the United States pressed France to make more reforms in Vietnam, to make things like land reform. They realized that Bao Dai wasn't that popular. The United States promised France $133 million in aid for its colony, and even promised a small military advising group known as the Military Assistance and Advisory Group, or MAG. MAG was the first time that the U.S. military had been in Vietnam. They weren't combat troops, they were advisors, but nevertheless it was the first time the United States had been in Vietnam. The U.S. continued to pressure Bao Dai to make reforms, but the French were very sensitive to Americans telling them what they do, and they didn't follow through. About the only thing that the French did do that the Americans wanted them to do is reorganize the Southern Army, which they called the Vietnamese National Army. And, it was just so obvious by the end of the Truman administration that the U.S. was in a much more complex and dangerous situation than it had been in at the end of World War II only 7 years before. The U.S. felt a commitment to defend Vietnam because they saw it as part of their accepted containment philosophy. They didn't see it as a nationalist struggle. At the same time, they didn't want to get actively involved in the fight in the war, preferring to support the French efforts. The French, however, were not doing as the Americans thought they should, and they sort of resisted American advice. The U.S., therefore, was kind of in a quagmire as Truman, left the White House. This includes the section on the background of the Vietnam War and Truman's contributions to it.